Hello, I'm Novelette, and welcome to Morgen Talk. What is the American dream? For African Americans in the early 20th century, that simply meant freedom and opportunity. Two factors that led many to California. My guest today is historian and author of Living the California Dream, African Americans' Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era, Dr. Alison Jefferson, who will talk with us about those early pioneers' road to living the California dream. Hello, Dr. Jefferson. It's such a pleasure to speak with you today.
And hello there, Novelette. Nice to speak with you today, too.
Okay. So could you tell us, at the beginning of the 20th century, what was the leisure environment like for African Americans in California?
Well, African Americans were moving to California from all over the United States, but mostly from the South, because that's where most of them were living at that point in time, to come to the state just as everyone else was coming here to have the opportunity to make new life experiences for themselves. And that meant also enjoying what the scenic outdoor offerings were of California as well. And the population was relatively small during that time period in terms of African Americans. So there was discrimination, but there wasn't the discrimination that was wholesale as it was in the South and other parts of the country, because the numbers were so small. So there was not, there were laws already on the California books in that got on the California books, civil rights laws in the 1890s, which said that public spaces were open to everyone. Now, sometimes those laws were not enforced, but African Americans did have an opportunity to experience what California had to offer.
I see. All right. And in your book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era, you wrote, California presented a complex web of laws and practices regulating housing, land ownership, labor, and marriage for communities of color. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Well, because of the fact that in terms of California, we had a multi-ethnic population, discrimination was metered out in different ways, depending on whether you were a Black person, a Mexican person, a Chinese person, a Japanese person, a Korean person, and also depending on what part of the state you were living in. So in Los Angeles and in San Francisco and in San Diego, you had more diversity of people living together with whites. And then maybe in some other parts of the state, you didn't have all the different ethnic groups that I've just mentioned. So in Southern California, in Los Angeles, you had a large Chinese population. And there was discrimination against the Chinese population from the standpoint that they could not they couldn't buy land, as well as the Japanese people. They couldn't buy land, and they couldn't marry outside of their group. And for a long time, they wouldn't let Chinese men bring Chinese women to the United States. So there were all these crazy things that were going on at that time in terms of African Americans. In some places, the restrictive racial covenants were implemented, and they might not enforce them against Black people, but they would enforce them against Chinese and Japanese people. Or in some other area, they might enforce them against Black people, and they wouldn't enforce them against Asians or against Mexican Americans. And Mexican Americans were considered white at that time, because when Mexico became part of the United States, that was one of the stipulations. Well, what does that mean? It depends on where you are. Some places, the Mexican American population didn't have any problems because they still were landowners, and they, if they weren't, they faded into the white population. And then in other places, where there was a really strong cultural community of Mexicans, that was not the case. There was discrimination.
I see, I see. And on that note, can you tell us a little bit about Bruce's Beach?
So Bruce's Beach was one of the early African-American beach resort communities. And it was started by Willa Bruce and her husband, Charles, and her son supported her endeavors in 1912. And it was initially a very small affair with a pop-up tent where she was serving refreshments, and had some other small tents where people could change their clothes. And they evolved into a larger resort with a bigger building that had a dance hall and a cafe. And then they had a couple of other structures there on the site to support the resort business, and they had a few overnight accommodations. The place was something that was enjoyed by Black Angelenos who would take the streetcar down to Manhattan Beach, or at that time, it's still in 1912 when it started, people would have been taking a horse and buggy down there as well as taking the streetcar. And then as the car became more prevalent with people owning them, or having friends that had them, then people would drive down to Manhattan Beach. So the resort was popular, but it faced racism from the day that it opened. And there was a big newspaper article in the Los Angeles Times, if you can imagine that, in 1912, within the week that the resort opened, talking about the white people not being happy that this little resort that was in an isolated area in Manhattan Beach, not where most of the white folks were, was a problem for a few white folks.
I see. And then what eventually happened in that case?
So eventually in 1924, after the Bruces had built their structure there, and there had been several events, happy events there in terms of people enjoying the place, there was a white contingency that was able to get a petition together to say that they wanted to get the Black people out of there. They couched it in, we need a park in this area. And so they couched it in, we need a park, and we want to take this land of where the Bruce's resort was, and the small resort community that had grown up around it between 26th and 27th Street and the Strand and Highland. We want to take that land and make it a park. And there were less than a dozen families that that owned the property, and only a half a dozen who had actually built structures on their property. And most of those people were Black people who had built these structures. So they took the land through eminent domain, and they said they were going to build a park, and they didn't build a park for another 40 years. African Americans did fight to keep the land in terms of the 1920 situation, and the case of the compensation wasn't settled until 1929. But they raised the buildings, all the buildings, the Bruce's Resort and all the other buildings, by 1925. And Black people were still going down there because there were still a few African Americans who had property outside of this beach area. And there's even a family that still owns property there in that general area. They've had that property since around 1916. And there's maybe a few others down there that faded into the white population that we're not aware of. But I know that there's one Black family down there that owns property. They don't live there, but they own the property. And I know one other African American family that owned their property there until 76 in that general area. So, so with that, there was a beach wade-in that happened because in 1927, because during that time, even though African Americans were still going to the beach there were all kinds of subterfuge measures to keep them from using the beach. And so one of them was they said that the city said they had leased the land to one of the citizens there for some activity. And it turned out that, and so he roped the beach off to keep the Black people from using the beach. And they went out there and used it anyway, and they got arrested. And so folks were protesting these arrests that occurred with the NAACP having a wade-in down there in 27. And with that wade-in, a few more people got arrested, including the head of the NAACP at that time, H. Claude Hudson. And with that, there were some fines paid and some other legal maneuvers, and clarity was won at that point in time that African Americans could use any of the public beaches in the state. Even though that happened, that didn't mean that African Americans felt like they were going to continue to go to Manhattan Beach, because there was now no public facility for them to go and enjoy the beach. And so I think that at that point in time, people just decided it's easier to go to Santa Monica than to try to continue to go down to Manhattan Beach. So at that point, they chased out all the Black people. They chased out the generational wealth that could have occurred. They chased out a community developing there of African Americans. And today we still see the remnants of that result, with less than 1% of the population in Manhattan Beach being African American. And there's more Asians and other marginalized groups that are there in Manhattan Beach than there are African Americans. And the park, in terms of contemporary times, has become a site of celebration, site of conscience, site of pilgrimage, site of healing, because of all of the things that have happened in the last year with the pandemic and the struggle for Black dignity and against police brutality rising up again, and the Black Lives Matter movement prominently putting it on the national and the global stage, that the Black struggle is still here. Mm-hmm. And we just recently, in the last week, had another illustration of the Black struggle still being here in terms of December 2020, with this young man being killed. He wasn't even that young, he's in his 40s, being killed in Ohio in his driveway because he had a cell phone in his hand and his other hand was in his pocket. So the struggle continues.
Yes. It's scary still, nonetheless. Okay, another quote from your book.
Yes, it is scary, but we have had some progress that has occurred, but we just have not had as much as we would like.
Right. And speaking of progress, another quote that you have in your book, Living the California Dream, you stated that some African Americans had experience that seemed to justify a faith in the promise of upward mobility and the California Dream. Can you give us an example of what that meant? What was that like?
Well, I mean, think about the people that I was just speaking about who came here to California in the early part of the 20th century. The fact that they could buy this beachfront property in Manhattan Beach gave people new ideas about who they could be in terms of their lives. And although that particular site was eventually not successful, it still gave people the idea of the possibilities of what could occur. And then at the same time, as I mentioned, in terms of that site down there in Manhattan Beach, there were some families that were able to continue to own property there, and those were second homes for them. And then in terms of families in Los Angeles, there were many families in Los Angeles that came here from other places, and they bought homes immediately because they came with money, or they worked and saved money, or both, to buy property. We had the development of African-American wealth even from the 19th century, because there were some families here in the 19th century who were here in the 1850s, and they were able to take advantage of all the real estate booms from the 1850s into the 20th century. And those kinds of things influenced other people coming to Los Angeles. They could see that, you know, these families had made money. There were several realtors at the early part of the 20th century that were developing tracts of land. Sidney P. Dones was one of them, and he was involved in developing the Valverde African-American Resort, which is in North Los Angeles County near Santa Clarita. And that was that was something that was an aspirational as well as real economic development opportunity. But just normal folks were able to buy a house here and there. They were living in one and maybe renting out the property to other folks. So there were a lot of people that were able to do that. And as early as 1920, African Americans in Los Angeles had higher rates of home ownership than any metropolitan area in the country.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.